The barking of restless dogs echoed through the cold, sterile halls of the county animal shelter. Metal kennels lined the dimly lit corridor, each cage housing a different dog, some staring out with hopeful eyes and wagging tails, while others lay in the shadows, forlorn and resigned. It was late afternoon, just after closing, and a heavy sense of finality hung in the air. In a small kennel tucked away at the far end of the shelter sat two aging dogs. Their muzzles were grayed, their fur thinning, and their bodies bore the marks of relentless time. Bruno, a large German Shepherd mix with a dense black and tan coat, lay protectively beside Daisy, a smaller Retriever mix with a soft golden coat and gentle eyes. They had been together in this shelter for 8 long years, a lifetime in a place where young, lively dogs came and went quickly. Both Bruno and Daisy had arrived at the shelter as strays when they were younger, found in different parts of town. Bruno had been discovered wandering the edges of an old industrial park, while Daisy was found abandoned near a highway rest area. Though they came from different paths, a shared loneliness had drawn them together, and over time they had become inseparable. The two found comfort in each other, sharing meals, sleeping close, and leaning on one another, forming a quiet bond that needed no words. Bruno and Daisy had become inseparable over the years. They shared everything: meals, sleeping spaces, and companionship, leaning on each other with a quiet bond that seemed to go beyond words. But today felt different. Today was the day they would say goodbye. Bruno and Daisy, due to their age and health issues, had been labeled as unadoptable. The shelter was already overfilled, and as always, tough decisions had to be made. The two elderly dogs had been on the euthanasia list for weeks, with their time extended as long as possible in hopes that maybe, just maybe, someone would take them in. But no one had. Bruno's arthritis had grown so severe that some days he could hardly stand, while Daisy struggled with a heart condition that made her breathing labored and painful. The final decision had been made. Dr. Lawson, the shelter's head veterinarian, walked down the hallway with a heavy heart, her clipboard feeling like a weight she could barely carry. She had faced these decisions many times, yet they never grew easier. Over the years, she had learned to separate herself from the emotional toll of the work, the endless cycle of hope and heartbreak that defined shelter life. But something about Bruno and Daisy made this time harder than usual. Dr. Lawson had watched them grow old together, had seen them greet each other each morning with gentle licks, as if to reassure each other, "We're still here." She had seen Bruno lie beside Daisy when she was unwell, his large frame curling protectively around her smaller body. The entire shelter staff had grown fond of them, but the reality of shelter life was harsh. Resources were limited, and younger, healthier dogs had better chances of finding homes. For Bruno and Daisy, their time had run out. As Dr. Lawson neared their kennel, a familiar knot of guilt formed in her chest. She glanced down at her clipboard one last time, steadying herself. She loathed this part of her job, yet she knew it was sometimes necessary. Letting them continue to suffer in their ailments would be cruel, but the finality of it all felt unbearable. Taking a deep breath, "Doctor." Lawson opened the kennel door and stepped inside. Bruno and Daisy were huddled together, heads resting on one another in a pose that spoke of both comfort and resignation. But something was different this time. Dr. Lawson stopped in her tracks. Bruno had wrapped both his front paws around Daisy in a clear, intentional embrace. His large body curled protectively around her as Daisy nestled her head against his chest. Her eyes closed with an expression of peace. They weren't just lying close, as they often did. This was a true embrace, the kind you might see between two people saying their last goodbyes. It was as if they understood what was about to happen, as though they were offering each other comfort in their final moments. Dr. Lawson blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She had dedicated her life to caring for animals, but she had never witnessed anything like this. The gesture was so intentional, so incredibly human in its tenderness, that it sent a shiver down her spine. Kneeling beside Bruno and Daisy, her eyes filled with tears. Bruno slowly opened one of his deep brown eyes, glancing up at her with a quiet acceptance that seemed to hold a flicker of awareness and understanding. He knew. They both knew. A surge of emotion overcame Dr. Lawson, and she felt an overwhelming urge to stop. She couldn't go through with it, not yet. "Sam," she called, her voice trembling. Sam, the shelter assistant, had been cleaning kennels down the hall. Looking up in confusion, Sam set down her supplies and walked over. "What's wrong, Doctor? Lawson?" she asked. "Bring me the scanner," Dr. Lawson replied urgently. "I want to check their chips one more time." Sam raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "But we've scanned them dozens of times already. No owners, no information, no history." "I know," Dr. Lawson said, swallowing hard. "But something doesn't feel right. I need to check again." Shrugging, Sam fetched the handheld microchip scanner from a nearby desk. She knelt beside Bruno and pressed the scanner to his neck. The familiar beep sounded, and the same information appeared. Bruno, stray, no known owner, found near an industrial park 8 years ago. There was nothing unusual. Sam moved on to Daisy, scanning her neck next. The device beeped, showing the same details. Daisy, stray, abandoned near a highway. But just as Sam was about to pull the scanner away, it beeped again, louder this time, and a new piece of information flashed on the screen. Her eyes widened in shock as she stared at the display. "Dr. Lawson, you need to see this," Sam whispered, her voice shaking as she handed over the scanner. Dr. Lawson took the device, her heart pounding. She looked down at the small screen, her breath catching as she read the words. "Daisy, registered to the United States Army, K-9 unit." "What?" Dr. Lawson murmured, her mind racing. This couldn't be right. Daisy had been listed as a stray for years. How could she have a military background? Sam, equally stunned, said, "There's no way. She's been here 8 years. Why would the military—" Before they could process what they had uncovered, Sam quickly ran the scanner over Bruno again. The machine chirped loudly, and another new entry appeared on the screen. "Bruno, registered to the United States Army K-9 unit." Dr. Lawson's mind reeled. Both dogs were registered to the military. How had no one known? How had they ended up here, forgotten in an overcrowded shelter for nearly a decade? "We need to call the military," Sam whispered, barely above a breath. "There has to be an explanation." Dr. Lawson nodded, still in shock. "Get me the number for the nearest base. We need to figure this out, right away." For the next few hours, the shelter was a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Lawson and Sam worked tirelessly, making phone calls, gathering records, piecing together the dog's past. As they delved deeper, a remarkable story began to emerge. Bruno and Daisy had served together as part of a specialized K-9 unit for the United States Army. They had been deployed overseas, providing essential support to soldiers in dangerous zones, sniffing out explosives and conducting search and rescue missions. The two had been partners, trained and deployed side by side, inseparable through it all. But during one particularly dangerous mission, something had gone wrong. The records were incomplete, but it seemed that during a chaotic extraction, Bruno and Daisy had become separated from their handlers. They were listed as missing in action, presumed lost. Years passed, and they had disappeared from the radar, assumed dead by the military. Yet somehow, against all odds, Bruno and Daisy had survived. They had found their way back, though no one knew exactly how. Eventually, they ended up as strays, brought to this small, understaffed shelter where they had languished, unnoticed and forgotten for 8 long years. After Dr. Lawson and Sam finally reached the right military officials, the story spread rapidly through the chain of command. Within hours, arrangements were made to transfer Bruno and Daisy to a specialized retirement program for military working dogs, a place where they could live out their remaining years in peace and comfort. The following morning, a military representative arrived at the shelter. Dr. Lawson stood by their kennel, watching as Bruno and Daisy were gently led out side by side. True to their bond, the dogs looked back at her, their eyes holding the same quiet understanding they had shown the day before. "They're heroes," the representative said, shaking his head in disbelief as he gazed down at the two elderly dogs. "And they saved each other." As Dr. Lawson watched Bruno and Daisy leave the shelter for the last time, a deep sense of relief washed over her. They had come so close to the end, only to be saved at the very last moment. Their bond had carried them through the hardest times, and now, against all odds, they were heading toward the future they deserved. Dr. Lawson stood motionless, her eyes locked on them as they walked side by side through the shelter doors. The military representative, Sergeant Cole, was a rugged man in his late 40s with a face lined by years of service. Yet his expression softened as he watched the two old dogs with quiet admiration. "I've seen plenty of canines in my time," he said, his voice rough yet respectful. "But what they did for each other, that kind of loyalty is rare." Dr. Lawson nodded, her throat tight with emotion, deeply moved by the unbreakable connection she had witnessed. "I didn't realize how special they were," Dr. Lawson admitted, still trying to absorb everything that had happened in the past day. "They were just two old strays. I had no idea they had a story, that they were heroes." "They've always been heroes," Sergeant Cole replied, giving Bruno a respectful pat on the head before bending down to gently inspect Daisy's paw. "But now they're going to get the treatment they deserve." As he spoke, Daisy looked up at him with tired eyes, giving a small tentative wag of her tail, as if she sensed the change in her fate. Bruno, ever the protector, remained close to her side, his large frame poised like a guardian. A lump formed in Dr. Lawson's throat as she watched them. 8 years, 8 long, lonely years in the shelter, waiting and hoping, never knowing if their past would come back for them. She had been on the verge of ending their lives, but now they were walking toward a new beginning, a second chance that few shelter dogs ever received. Standing straight, Sergeant Cole cleared his throat. "They'll be taken to a special facility for retired K9S. It's quiet, peaceful, just outside the city. They'll receive medical care, proper food, and most importantly, they'll be treated with the respect they've earned." He looked down at the dogs with admiration. "Dogs like these have seen and endured things we can't even imagine. They deserve to rest." Dr. Lawson glanced over at Sam, who was standing nearby, wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the day's events. Sam had barely spoken since the moment they discovered Bruno and Daisy's history. Even for someone used to shelter life, it had been a profoundly emotional day. Dr. Lawson could see tears glistening in Sam's eyes as they both watched the scene unfold. "I still can't believe it," Sam whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They hugged each other, Dr. Lawson. They were saying goodbye, weren't they? They thought it was the end." Dr. Lawson nodded, her voice a barely audible whisper. Yes, they knew. But as she watched Bruno and Daisy being gently led away, she realized there was more to it than a goodbye. They hadn't just been preparing for an end. They had been protecting each other, just as they had done on those long-ago battlefields. That bond, that unspoken connection, had carried them through whatever horrors they'd faced in war and the long years of solitude in the shelter. As Sergeant Cole guided Bruno and Daisy toward the waiting military vehicle, something unexpected happened. Bruno, usually calm and stoic, suddenly turned to look back at Dr. Lawson. His deep brown eyes, full of wisdom and experience, held hers for a long, intense moment. There was no sadness or fear in his gaze, only gratitude, as if he were silently saying, "Thank you for seeing us, for saving us." Beside him, Daisy also paused. Her golden fur shimmered softly in the fading afternoon light as she gave a tiny nod, almost like a gesture of thanks, before following her loyal companion into the vehicle. Dr. Lawson stood frozen as the car pulled away, her heart heavy yet full. She had come so close to losing them, to letting them slip away into the unknown, but now, against all odds, they had a future. They had each other, and as she watched them disappear down the road, she felt certain they had always been destined for something greater. In the weeks that followed, Bruno and Daisy thrived in their new home. The shelter received regular updates from Sergeant Cole, and each one brought more good news. The retirement facility was a sanctuary of peace, far from the chaos of the shelter and the memories of the battlefield. There, Bruno and Daisy spent their days side by side, finally enjoying the safety and comfort they had longed for, and the peace they had truly earned. In the weeks following Bruno and Daisy's arrival at the retirement facility, Dr. Lawson received regular updates from Sergeant Cole. Each time, the news was brighter and more heartwarming. The retirement home for military canines was a true sanctuary, a peaceful refuge far removed from the chaos of the shelter and the intensity of their former lives. Sprawled across a vast stretch of land, it was complete with wide-open fields, shady trees, and even a small pond where the dogs could cool off on warm days. Bruno had started special treatments for his arthritis. Though he would never regain his former speed, the medications helped him move with greater ease, restoring some of his strength. Meanwhile, Daisy was under the careful watch of the facility's veterinarians, receiving the care she needed for her heart condition. She too was showing improvement. Together they spent their days lounging side by side in the sun, finally enjoying the space, freedom, and peace they deserved. Then, one day, Dr. Lawson received a call from Sergeant Cole that changed everything once again. "We found their handler," he said, his voice steady but brimming with excitement. "The soldier who trained and worked with Bruno and Daisy. He thought they were gone, lost forever. When we told him they were alive, well, let's just say he can't wait to see them." Dr. Lawson's heart raced. "You found him? After all this time?" Sergeant Cole chuckled. "It took a lot of digging. The military doesn't keep track of retired handlers as closely as they do the dogs, but we got lucky. He's coming next week." The news filled Dr. Lawson with joy and a touch of nervous anticipation. Bruno and Daisy were about to reunite with the person who had meant the most to them during their years of service. She couldn't help but wonder, after all these years, would the dogs remember him? Would they recognize him? The day of the reunion arrived quickly, and Dr. Lawson couldn't resist the urge to be there herself. She arrived at the K9 retirement facility early in the morning, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had grown so attached to Bruno and Daisy and couldn't wait to see how they would react when they saw their old handler again. Sergeant Chris Reynolds, a tall man with broad shoulders and a warm smile, had served multiple tours overseas with Bruno and Daisy by his side. They had been his faithful partners, helping him navigate dangerous terrain, detect explosives, and save lives. As he walked into the facility's courtyard, his steps slowed as his eyes fell on the two dogs lying in the shade of a tree. Dr. Lawson stood beside him, watching closely. Bruno and Daisy, now older and grayer, lifted their heads at the sound of footsteps approaching. Bruno was the first to react. His ears perked up, and for a moment, his body tensed. Slowly he rose to his feet, his old bones creaking with effort. Yet there was something unmistakable in his movement, a sense of recognition. Daisy also lifted her head, her soft brown eyes blinking as if piecing together the figure walking toward them. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, her tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster as the memories flooded back. Sergeant Reynolds crouched down, his hands trembling slightly. "Bruno, Daisy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Bruno took a hesitant step forward, his gaze locked on Reynolds. Then, in an instant, something extraordinary happened. Bruno's posture shifted, his tail started to wag, and with a surge of energy that no one expected from the elderly dog, he dashed forward, nearly stumbling but determined to reach his old handler. Daisy followed close behind, her tail wagging so hard it seemed to shake her whole body. She let out a soft, high-pitched whimper of joy as she reached Reynolds, pressing her head firmly against his chest. Tears filled Sergeant Reynolds' eyes as he wrapped his arms around them both, whispering, "I thought I'd lost you. I thought I'd lost you," Sergeant Reynolds whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I thought you were gone." Dr. Lawson stood back, tears streaming down her face as she watched the reunion unfold. Bruno and Daisy hadn't just survived. They had been waiting for this moment, for the one person who had meant the world to them during their years of service. Now, they were together again, a family once more. In the months that followed, Bruno and Daisy spent their days with Sergeant Reynolds, who visited the retirement facility often. He took them on walks through the open fields, played with them under the shade of the trees, and sat by the pond where they could cool off in the water. The bond they shared with him had never been broken, and now, in the twilight of their lives, they were finally able to experience the peace and love they had earned through years of service and sacrifice. Dr. Lawson continued to visit as well, her heart full each time she saw the three of them together, Bruno, Daisy, and Sergeant Reynolds. It was a happy ending she could never have imagined when she first walked into the shelter that fateful day. Bruno and Daisy had been more than just strays. They had been soldiers, survivors, and loyal friends. Now, they were home. In the end, it wasn't just their bravery or loyalty that had saved them. It was the love they held for each other. The unbreakable bond they shared had carried them through every challenge, every heartbreak, and every moment of uncertainty. That bond had saved their lives, and it would carry them through the time they had left. As Dr. Lawson looked at them lying peacefully together in the grass, she knew one thing for certain: Bruno and Daisy's story was far from over. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We release a brand new episode every day, so stay tuned. Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.